Hi, thanks for tuning in to episode 2 of the Crying is Manly podcast, where we talk about men's mental health with a focus on embracing vulnerability and living authentically. So in this episode, I want to talk about actually one of my favorite movies of all time. It's called I Heart Huckabees. The heart is the little emoji, and it stars Jason Schwartzman, Mark Wahlberg, Lily Tomlin, Dustin Hoffman, Jason Schwartzman, Jude Law, Isabella Huppert, Naomi Watts, Jonah Hill, and others. Yeah, the cast is just amazing. And it's what I would call, I guess you could call it an existential comedy. It's a little bit hard to explain. One of the most amazing things about this film, though, is it's a different experience based on where you're at in life, because pretty much the whole movie revolves around these really deep questions and these various existential crises. Depending on where you're at in life, it's going to feel different, if that makes sense. So if you are currently in the breakup at 3 a.m, eating the bucket of ice cream, versus if you just started a business, versus if you just finished college, like wherever you're at, it might feel a lot different, especially if you're specifically in one of said crises. One of my favorite scenes in this movie is there's a scene with Jude Law, Dustin Hoffman, and Lily Tomlin, where Jude Law, he says, "How am I not myself?" And he just says it off the cuff. They say, "Are you being yourself?" And Jude Law says, "How am I not myself?" Like almost incredulously, flippantly, not quite, but almost. "What do you mean? Of course I'm myself. Everyone's their self." Dustin Hoffman and Lily Tomlin just repeat it back to him. And he starts to get more and more upset. "No, but for real though, how am I not myself?" Like, WTF, guys? What's going on? They just repeat it to him, and then they repeat it to each other. And so you've got Dustin Hoffman and Lily Tomlin just facing each other, saying emphatically, "How am I not myself?" So Jude Law gets all frazzled, and he stumbles out of the room and is in a daze almost. And you hear Dustin Hoffman's voice saying, "How am I not myself?" And it's almost that moment where the record keeps playing the same bit, like at the same 4 seconds or whatever. It's doing that. It's like a little loop of Dustin Hoffman saying that. One of the things the movie does too is at the end of the credits, instead of a post-credit scene, there's just that phrase. So in just large font, "How am I not myself?" I love this. I love this question. I love this sentence. I love the phrase. I think especially in modern society / Western society, I think there's so many ways in which we are not ourselves. And specifically, just coming back around to the angle of this podcast itself, there's so many ways that we as men and boys, whether implicitly or explicitly, it's communicated to us that maybe we shouldn't be ourselves, or maybe a certain way to bring ourselves to a situation is the way it needs to be done. Oh, you need to do this if you want to be masculine, or since you're a man, you don't get to have an opinion on XYZ conversation, or obviously, given the name of the podcast, oh, it's not manly to cry. So if you are a crier, don't be yourself, because you can't be a man and you can't cry a lot. Those are incongruent, incompatible. And again, specifically in Western culture, I've only lived in the US and Australia. I've traveled a bit, but I don't have a huge perspective on a bunch of different countries. But in the US, it's pretty common to start various kinds of conversations and first impressions with, "Oh, what do you do?" And I've always hated that question, man, since I was a kid, because it's such a narrow funnel and it's so backwards. Like it's almost like it becomes even before "How are you?" because they haven't met you yet, right? It's such an absurd way to bridge that first connection, because if you want to talk about being yourself or not, like obviously you are not your job. Sorry to break it to you, people who that's part of their identity. But yeah, you're not your job. You're not your career. And in fact, we can expand that. You are not your reputation. You are not your hobbies. You are not your abilities. You are not your accomplishments. You're certainly not your failures. But if you want to get a bit deeper on this, you are not your thoughts. You are not your opinions. You are not your emotions. And you are not your beliefs. Every single one of those things is malleable. Jobs change, reputations change, hobbies change, abilities change. What you accomplish or fail at will obviously change. And even our thoughts, opinions, emotions, and beliefs change. Those are all malleable. Plenty of people go through huge changes in those. So you're none of those things. You're not your job, your reputation, your hobbies, your abilities, your accomplishments, failures, thoughts, opinions, emotions, or beliefs. I'm sure there's 5, 10, 20 other we could add to that list. So if you're not those things, what are you? Who are you? And I think some people tuning into this might be like, whoa, that's pretty deep, bro. What are you doing? I didn't sign up for this. Fair enough. But I think just coming back to the question, how am I not myself? If you just ask yourself that, you might be surprised. You might have some interesting answers clanging around in your head that we're just waiting for that kind of a question to be asked of them. Because of course, without getting too super philosophical or spiritual, of course, whatever you is, whatever you are, whatever being a you is, that's not changing, right? So whether you think of yourself as a consciousness or a soul or what have you, obviously, if somebody says, is that yourself? You could say, well, sure, yeah. But how does yourself present to the world? But really, we don't even necessarily need to get that much into it. I think just focusing on the question is sufficient. Asking yourself, how am I not myself? And whenever you take that question to mean, I think it's a very interesting question with interesting answers. You could process it as like a spiritual question. Am I not this body? Am I not this mind? Am I not this soul? Or you could approach it much more pragmatically. Again, being myself. Am I identifying too much with my job? Am I never being myself? Are there parts of myself I'm hiding from everyone? Are there parts of myself I'm hiding from myself even? This consciousness that's experiencing the things it experiences on a day-to-day basis, is it being the self it wants to be? What are the ways that it's going against what it wants to be and wants to do? What kinds of stories are you telling yourself that do not match reality and or do not match the truth about who you are or what you want, what you need? Stories are extremely important. A lot of us tend to cling to either false stories or warped stories or incomplete stories or stories that were more sort of a tool to get us through something and they don't serve us anymore, but we're still clinging to them. And just like you're not your job, you're not your thoughts, you're not your emotions, you're also not your stories. You don't want to be this just collection of maybe correct, maybe not stories. It's wild. It's so interesting to me that especially in these days with social media, everything is so fast and so reactive and so drained of nuance and so focused on, online at least, so focused on sarcasm and dunking and whataboutism and what's the latest thing to get upset about. It's like nobody stops to think, is this even what I want to be doing? Am I even being true to myself? If what I am is a person who does these things, who does this mindless scrolling of short video content for 7 hours straight, or playing video games for 40,000 hours, or whatever other thing that's concerningly common now. If that's what I'm doing, is that really myself? Am I really being myself? And if that's not myself, then what is the real self that I could be being? That's not those things. Because, yeah, I got to break it to you. The internet's not real life. So I mentioned in the last episode the amount of interesting and wonderful and surprising things that have happened since deciding to start this podcast. Because it's only been about 6 weeks, give or take, since I concretely made the decision to start it and started taking real measurable action towards doing so. It's been just nuts, the amount of things that have happened since then. And one of my main takeaways, one of my main sort of through lines during all of this has been, man, the internet is not real life. I will probably do an episode on this soon, maybe even just titled "The Internet is Not Real Life," because it's wild, man. Every person I've talked to one-on-one, either in person or on Zoom or over the phone, part of you is always, oh no, what if they're XYZ group that's not a good thing to be, or what if they're some kind of ism, whatever. So barring that, because I don't know everything about them, I can't. They seem great. They seem like just people. And something that's been really interesting too is a few times it'll come up in conversation like, oh, hey, one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast is to try to bring a different energy than these other things that are unbeknownst to the men, are harmful to men and boys for this, that, and the other reason. I've had the person say, oh, what's that? This particular movement or podcast or forum or individual, whatever it is, it'll come up and they'll say, oh, what's that? I haven't heard of that. And it still has been blowing me away, because if you hop online, depending on what part of the internet you're on, it seems like everybody's mad and everybody's crazy, regardless of what side of which thing you're on. It just seems like everything is crazy, everything's nuts, all people are bad, nothing's going to work, and blah, blah, blah. But it's happening over and over again. These guys I've been meeting, some of them I'm just talking about like ideas for the podcast. Some of them will end up being guests, and that's why I talked to them. Some of them was just brainstorming, various kind of people for various reasons. But it was fascinating how many times they hadn't heard of these really damaging things out there that I just took as a given that kind of everyone knew about, because I've worked in social media. I'm online a lot. If you ask somebody who's on Twitter all the time, hey, what's the world like? And they said, oh, this just trended and this, that, and the other. And this group is angry about this thing that happened yesterday. If they're on Twitter all the time and they don't really think about where they're getting their info, they might just assume that everyone knows the things that they just rattled off. But it's possible that it's a very small percentage of people saying those things very loudly. And if that's the only place you're looking at, just seeing it there doesn't mean that's the only thing being said. Again, just to reiterate, the internet's not real life. So just to wrap this up, first of all, I do encourage you to watch I Heart Huckabees. It's a great film with a great cast, and it raises some really interesting questions. But also I encourage you to ask yourself that question, how am I not myself? If you're the journaling type, you could do it as a journal. I will admit that I don't reflect on these kinds of things as often as I would like, but I think it can be a very powerful question with interesting answers if you give yourself time and space to think on it. And these days, where everything is so tightly wound and so reactionary, I think asking ourselves questions such as, how am I not myself, is one of the many things we can do to slow down and try to combat that a bit. So until next time, let me know if there's a particular way you've been not being yourself, or if there's a particular thing you have been feeling or wanting to be or do, and you don't feel like you can. Let me know. And in the meantime, just remember, crying is manly.